Thank you very much, Darina, and good morning, everybody. It's nice to be back. I hope week 2 is going very well for your course. My job is to raise some challenges, basically, and to pose some questions to you about how we think the APSA is working at the moment. And so before I get a bit depressing and critical, I want to start off on some positive notes and say, as Darina's already outlined, you're all familiar with the APSA institutions. And so when I talk about the APSA, I am, as Darina's already mentioned, talking about this cluster of institutions that are meant to deal with peace and security challenges on the continent. But I want to also add in a few other institutions that it takes to make the APSA work. The AU Commission, the regional economic communities and the 2 regional mechanisms for North Africa and East Africa. The AU member states themselves, obviously, without which nothing can happen. Just to reiterate then, I want to start with some good news about the African peace and security architecture before I get a bit more depressing with a lot of the challenges. I would just add to Darina's description of the APSA. For the APSA to actually work, it doesn't just need the institutions that Darina has already talked about. For the APSA to actually do things like deploy peacekeepers, send mediation missions, etc., it relies on a range of partners. And as you heard already, this is the theme of the course now, and this part of it about partnerships. We need the AU Commission to work effectively. We need the regional economic communities and the 2 regional mechanisms in North Africa and East Africa to work effectively. We need the AU member states themselves, who after all are the ones that possess soldiers, police, civilian expertise. We need the UN and a variety of its agencies, the UN Office to the African Union in Addis Ababa being the most important. We also need the European Union for financial and other support, and we need a range of bilateral partner states. I would say at the moment the most important have been the US, France, and the UK, but China, Turkey, and other countries are becoming more important in recent years. So before I get a bit more depressing, I want to say a few positive things about the APSA. Number one, if you think of the APSA as this big machinery of all these institutions, it's an amazing creation. And it's very important to remember this. Compared to the old days of the Organization of African Unity, this is leaps and bounds ahead of where we were then. So the APSA is an amazing creation, point one. Point two, I think the world is better off because we have the APSA. If we didn't have the APSA, we would really need to invent it. I think this cluster of institutions serves a variety of very important purposes, and so ignore what I'm going to say the rest really. We need the APSA, and we need it to function as well as possible. That being said, for the majority of my time, I want to talk about 7 challenges that I think are facing the APSA's architects and African states and partners when we think about peace and security challenges in Africa. The first challenge, I think, is how do we link the peace and security architecture and institutions to the governance architecture across the continent? And I say this for a couple of reasons. Number one, we know more and more of our peace and security challenges are going to be linked to our challenges with governance across the continent. More and more, the solutions to security challenges are going to lie with developing effective systems of governance at Africa's state level, sub-state level, regional level. And so this raises an important question of what are the links and the relationship between, as we already heard, like NEPAD and the African Peer Review Mechanism, the African Charter on Elections, Democracy and Governance, etc. How do we think about forging positive links between those institutions and the peace and security architecture institutions? And I think to my mind, it comes down to the question I put at the bottom there. What happens when some of our members of the APSA institutions are not doing well on the governance criteria and governance institutions? So, for example, of the 15 members on the Peace and Security Council at the moment, 7 of them are basically authoritarian, autocratic states. What does this say about trying to pursue effective and good governance solutions when some of the mechanisms of the peace and security architecture are run by or involved with some of those core problems? So that's, I think, challenge number one. Challenge number two, as Darina's already mentioned, is to think about how decision-making works in the APSA. And I think there are a couple of dimensions to this. The first one is the relationship between the African Union at the continental level and the RECs at the sub-regional level. Now, we know we have a memorandum of understanding from 2008 which sets out the theory of how decision-making is meant to work. And that theory is based on the concept or principle of subsidiarity. And most people would agree with the notion of subsidiarity that we should have local solutions to local problems. We should look first and foremost to the states and the regional institutions that are closest to the problem. However, the African Union's job is to coordinate and harmonize sub-regional responses to these problems. And as we've seen in real crises in Africa for the last 15 years or so, the African Union level and the regional level of the RECs have not always agreed on how to respond to particular crises, whether we look at Côte d'Ivoire in the west, or Madagascar in the southeast, or Somalia, or Burundi now at the moment. There have been differences of opinion between the AU level and the regional level. So the challenge for the APSA is, how do you bring those two perspectives to convergence or make them in sync? And some of the ideas I put out here, we have African Union liaison offices in some of the RECs at the moment, which is obviously helpful. We've also got, unfortunately, different and uneven levels of connection between the RECs when it comes to the continental early warning system. And we've also got the unresolved question of, should, for example, RECs have representatives sitting in the AU Peace and Security Council? The member states on the Peace and Security Council are supposed to represent member states. They're not supposed to speak for the RECs. But it raises a question of, how can we best funnel the RECs positions into the Peace and Security Council? Challenge number 3 is also related to decision making. But here, the problem is not between the AU and the RECs. Here, the problem is decision-making within the Peace and Security Council itself. So as Doreena's already mentioned, we have the 15 members on the Peace and Security Council that pass their various communiques. We're now up to about, nearly 600 or so communiques have been passed since 2004 when we set up the PSC. But there's a number of problems and challenges confronting the Peace and Security Council. Number one, I think fundamentally, how do you generate leverage over the conflict parties themselves? The African Union is trying to do conflict management, but it doesn't have big sticks or tasty carrots. So it's trying to do conflict resolution without big tools of coercive power or inducements. It doesn't have much economics, financial incentives to offer parties. So there's a big headache for the PSC. How do you actually generate leverage over conflict parties in the African continent? And that leads to a second part of the challenge, which is, once the PSC has passed all these communiques, how does it actually implement them and follow up on these decisions? How does it make sure that what it writes and calls for in its communiques is actually implemented on the ground, when it lacks, as I said, either big sources of coercion, sticks, or financial inducements, carrots? And a third challenge here is, when the PSC is writing its communiques, it doesn't explicitly think about the resource implications of them. It's all very well to say we want to deploy a peace operation to Somalia or Mali or Central African Republic or the Comoros or Burundi. But depending how big and how strong and how multidimensional and how many helicopters, what logistics support, what strategic lift might be needed, there are going to be very different resource implications. And the Peace and Security Council so far has not been good at being explicit about the resource consequences. Finally, as well, we know the PSC meets at different levels. It meets at the permanent representatives level, the foreign ministers level, and head of state. And if we look recently at the crisis in Burundi, we can see that there's sometimes problems of consistency between when the PSC takes decisions at the permanent reps level, the ambassadors. That may or may not be endorsed at the foreign ministers level, and as we saw in the case in Burundi earlier this year, at the heads of state level, took a very different view of the situation than the members. So the third challenge is about decision-making in the Peace and Security Council. The fourth challenge I want to identify is between what I call institutional designs and real crises. And the point here, as Doreen has already mentioned, is the African Standby Force is based on the concept of these 5 sub-regional forces, either working autonomously alone or coming together in a larger force. The problem is, of course, is that Africa's real security challenges do not always map neatly onto our regional frameworks that we've devised. So if you look at just 2 examples I've given here, if you think about the challenges in Mali in 2012, 2013, and you look at where Mali figures into the ECOWAS region, ECOWAS can't provide all the solutions to the challenges that the Mali crisis provides. You know, we need to have a solution in Mali. We need to involve Algeria, Morocco, Chad, and elsewhere. So we need more than just ECOWAS. Similarly, if you look at the Boko Haram problem emanating out of northeastern Nigeria, again, it straddles the regional frameworks that we have for the African Union. It needs to involve states inside and outside of ECOWAS. So when it comes to real security challenges and problems, they don't map neatly onto the architecture we've been building. So I think the challenge or the question we need to ask is, do we need to keep the 5 regional standby force model, or do we need to think about more flexible responses that are better aligned to dealing with the real challenges we face? And then challenge number 5, I think, goes back to what Doreen has already mentioned, that the African standby force, the scenarios for the standby force, were developed in 2003. And those 6 scenarios that were developed at the time, I would say, are rather sort of, they're stuck on very traditional notions of warfare and civil war in particular, and traditional notions of peacekeeping, where you have a pretty traditional either interstate war or a traditional civil war. And what I mean by a traditional civil war is you have really political insurgents and rebels who are trying to either capture state power or promote some type of political manifesto to change the makeup of the government. But as we've seen now in the last 10 years or so, that's not really what's happening in terms of Africa's major security challenges. Africa's civil wars, such as they are increasingly fought with groups that have not got a clear and obvious political manifesto. They're not necessarily trying to capture state power like some of the rebel movements were in the early 1990s. So the scenarios don't really work or fit with the types of armed conflicts we're seeing. And then the second challenge here is it's not just armed conflicts that are a major part of Africa's security challenges at the moment. You have to think more transnational security challenges if you look at the contemporary African scene. We're dealing with transnational terror networks. We're looking at a whole range of problems related to climate change and environmental degradation and how that feeds into things like pastoral conflicts and other types of challenges. We're dealing with a whole set of problems about transnational organized crime. We're dealing with problems about maritime insecurity. We've got increasingly, unfortunately, problems to do with health pandemics, Ebola just being the last one. So the question for APSA then becomes, well, what role is the African Standby Force going to play, and should it play, in all of these new transnational challenges? What role should the African Standby Force play in addressing transnational terror networks, organized crime syndicates, climate change related problems? Is there a role for it to play in maritime insecurity? All of these types of questions need to be, I think, put on the table. Which leads into the penultimate challenge, challenge 6. And this is to do with ACERC, the African Capacity for Immediate Response to Crises, which, as you probably know, grew out of the crisis in Mali in 2012, when ECOWAS and the AU had wanted to deploy a peace operation into Mali to stabilize the situation, but ultimately couldn't deploy until there was help from external partners and after France had intervened bilaterally in early 2013. Since then, we had a debate, as you again will know probably better than me, between the merits of the ACERC model, which was basically, as I put up here, the idea that we should form coalitions of the willing to go after and respond to particular sort of enforcement challenges. And we should think of ACERC as sort of smaller than the brigade-sized regional forces, but ACERC would be about marshalling a battle group-sized formation, a couple of battalions, 1,600 or so personnel, to do sort of short-term enforcement, counter-terrorism, maybe stabilization types of missions. The problem, of course, is that this is a very different model to the 5 regional standby forces. And we saw a debate then take place in the last 3 years or so at the African Union, where a number of countries volunteered support for ACERC and said, really, it's coalitions that are going to be the way of actually responding to crises, versus other countries that felt we needed to stick more closely with the regional standby forces that we'd been trying to build for the last 12 years or so. And now officially, again, as Dorina mentioned, after the Amani 2 exercise at the end of last year, where we thought at least 4 of the regional arrangements, North Africa obviously is not part of that equation at the moment, but 4 of the regional forces had, with their rapid deployment capabilities at least, reached some level of operational capability. At that point, the AU has sort of officially said, well, we no longer need ACERC, because if ACERC was going to be an interim mechanism while the African Standby Force was still becoming operational, now that we've had Amani 2, we no longer need ACERC. I would want to raise a couple of questions about that, because I think it might be unwise to sort of completely reject the ACERC model. If you look at what I said before about the mismatch between the regional standby force frameworks and our real challenges and real security crises, a coalition of the willing model might actually make more sense in terms of responding to those dynamics. There are also differences in ACERC in terms of authorization. Authorization would come direct from the Peace and Security Council. It wouldn't have to necessarily involve the RECs as much as the African Standby Force regions. And it raises a question about sort of logistics. What types of support do we need to provide to get rapid deployment into the field? Is it a better model to think about regional standby forces of brigade level size of force? Or is it better to think about sort of how do we provide just-in-time logistical support to coalitions of the willing that are going to assemble on a more flexible basis? And finally, the money. And I put the money at the end on purpose because at one level it's fundamental to all these challenges, but another level I think political will leads to financial solutions. We can generally find money when we treat issues with a degree of seriousness, and we generally find it hard to find money for things if we don't treat issues seriously. So I think the final challenge for APSA is how does it generate more indigenous sources of finance to support its methods. You'll see here, it's long known that Africa and the AU in particular is lacking sustainable, predictable and flexible financing for its conflict management activities. And if Africa cannot find sustainable, predictable and flexible funding, then it raises questions, I think, of credibility, local ownership and sustainability. If the APSA relies fundamentally on external donations and external finance, local African states and organizations will never be fully in control. They will never fully own the agenda. And in my line of work, at least, I judge seriousness as to if you're serious about something, it means you're willing to put your own resources into achieving it. If you're not willing to invest your own money and resources into something, then I would question the seriousness of that commitment. So the APSA currently faces some financial problems. Libya in particular has obviously changed now since 2011 in terms of the financial support that it will provide to the APSA. There's also an ongoing debate about will traditional partners and donors continue to support the APSA in the way they have done recently. Depending what happens, for example, with the EU over the next few years, it may quite plausibly mean a big cut in EU funding to APSA. And that has been a key part of the equation. So can Africa and the APSA find new donors, whether this be China, the Gulf states, Turkey, Brazil, India, Malaysia, whoever else? And this issue has become even more important because, as you'll know, in the middle of last year, the AU has now made a commitment to fund, as I put up here, 100% of its operational budget, 75% of the program budget, and 25% of the peace operations budget by 2020. which leads to the question I started with, well, what would be the potential indigenous sources of finance to support the APSA? And we've seen from the President Obasanjo's report and other reports that have been put out recently some ideas about how we might generate indigenous sources of finance, but everything is still up for debate on that front. So those are the challenges I would want us to think about, and look forward to your questions.